Welcome to my review of X-Men Apocalypse, directed by Bryan Singer, an action film centered on Professor Charles Xavier and his school of mutants as they revolt against a mutant of ancient Egypt, Apocalypse, who endeavors to eradicate all those who are without special powers. So if you're somebody who's been watching any of my videos as of lately, then you have probably heard me mention at least once that I am a huge fan of X-Men Days of Future Past, and it's one of my all-time favorite superhero films. Days of Future Past is fantastic, and it's one of the best summer blockbusters to come out of this decade so far. The movie is a nice little character piece, and I would even say that it offers something somewhat thought-provoking. And just before Bryan Singer returned to X-Men with Days of Future Past, there was also Matthew Vaughn's contribution to X-Men, and that was First Class, which I was a pretty big fan of as well. But as for X-Men Apocalypse, going into it, I went into it sort of cautiously because of all the negative reviews that it's been getting. And I'm going to tell you right now, I don't think this movie is as great as Days of Future Past, nor do I think it's as good as First Class even, but I definitely don't think it's bad. More often than not, I do find myself agreeing with the critics. However, there are times that I simply don't, and this is one of those times. This is a good, entertaining popcorn flick. In other words, it's not in the same caliber as the previous X-Men films. X-Men Apocalypse isn't the most intelligent film, though that's not saying that I think it's completely mindless or stupid, and I know some people might be tired of hearing this by now, but I gotta say it because it is the truth. It's not as dumb as something like BVS. This movie is not brain dead, and I genuinely had fun and was very much entertained by it almost all throughout its 2 hours and 17-minute runtime. And that's sure as hell a lot more than I can say about most summer blockbusters that I see every single year. And yeah, the characterization isn't as strong as it is in the previous films, and I think that might be due to the fact that this movie is very much crowded with new characters as well as old characters. Though with that said, and with the exclusion of the villains, which I will talk about in a second, I still found myself invested in the characters, the old, and somewhat with the new. James McAvoy returns as Charles Xavier, and out of all the performances in the film, I would definitely say that his is the strongest, followed by probably Michael Fassbender as Magneto. However, as a warning, they're still doing the whole "can Charles Xavier save Eric from becoming Magneto?" And at this point, it's just kind of ridiculous. And look, I understand that Eric hates humans, and he has reasons to hate humans, and this movie even attempts to provide more reasons as to why. The reason itself makes complete sense. It's how it's done, however, I think is just somewhat avoidable. Also, it sort of reminded me of Spider-Man 3. And not to mention, it's followed by something in the realm of one of these. And here's the thing, those never work, so don't ever do them. Now, one thing that I do need to address is Jennifer Lawrence as Mystique, and in the past I have been a Jennifer Lawrence fan. I've really enjoyed her performance in Silver Linings Playbook as well as some others. As for here, she's not bad, but it does seem like she's just completely not into it anymore. She's just sleepwalking through the role. Now, one performance and character that was a standout for me, as well as many others in Days of Future Past, was Evan Peters as Quicksilver. And Evan Peters, he does of course return, and this film does have its own Quicksilver skit. And in my opinion, it's better than what it was in Days of Future Past. And I could get why some people would have a problem with it, given that it is essentially Bryan Singer doing the same thing as he did in Days of Future Past, just doing it longer with different music. As for me, however, I freaking loved it. I think it looks good. It's hilarious, and I like the tune that it's accompanied by. And I thought the tune itself was quite complimentary. And for me, that scene alone was worth the price of admission. As for the newcomers that I referenced way back, there's Sophie Turner as Jean Grey, there is Ty Sheridan as Cyclops, and there's also Cody Smith McPhee, who plays Nightcrawler. These three, they do share a lot of scenes together, and they do have a bulk of the film that is devoted to them. And as much as I would have liked to see more depth provided to these characters, I did like these characters, and I thought the performances were quite good, especially given that these are younger actors. Moreover, one of the things that I really loved about X-Men Days of Future Past was that there were no clear-cut villains. There were only protagonists and antagonists. Here, not so much. As much of an Oscar Isaac fan that I am, Apocalypse is a terrible villain. He is the epitome of the one-note big baddie. His motivations are weak, and despite the flamboyance of his overall appearance, he's got about as much personality as a piece of drywall. And he essentially has two, maybe three modes, one being that he talks very quietly, almost in a whisper, the next being that he just straight up yells, and then the third being that he yells so much to the point where he has like this horrible reverb on his voice. Horrible villain, and the same adjective could be applied to his posse, and they look as tacky as he does. One thing that I need to address is the spectacle in the CGI. Some of it works, some of it doesn't, like the transformations, the powers that the characters display. I think those are fine. It's when the movie completely loses its shit and becomes this bombastic CGI-infested explosion fest is when the movie sort of falls apart, and that's mostly in the third act. And the thing about the X-Men movies is that the CGI has never been the most impressive, and the same could be said for Days of Future Past, but you buy into it because you buy into the characters. As I've already stated plenty of times, the writing just isn't as strong here, and comparing it to Days of Future Past, well, it's not as bulked out with oppressive CGI. Bigger is not always better, and when you're talking about movies, bigger is almost never better. However, to restate, I do think the combat works better, but when you're talking about the destruction of bridges, cities, that kind of thing, just nonsense in my opinion. As for any last statements before I give my rating, the Wolverine cameo that was teased in one of the trailers just really had no business being in the film. And one other thing that was bugging me as I was watching the film is that First Class takes place in the 60s. Days of Future Past takes place in the 70s. This one takes place in the 80s. We've been following the same set of characters for 2 decades, yet they haven't aged at all. There's even a line in the film by James McAvoy referring to the Rose Byrne character, and he's like, look at her, she hasn't aged a day. And I'm like, well, no shit, she really hasn't. She looks the same as well as you do. I mean, look, it's a huge nitpick. It's not even something that I'm counting against the film, but it's just something that bugged me. Overall, I know it sounds like I have a lot of problems with X-Men Apocalypse, and that's because I do, but I don't think it is a bad movie. I really don't. I had a lot of fun with it. I did like the characters. That's more than I could say about most blockbusters, for sure. Though to be fair, the previous films had such a great foundation for these characters, that might have been why I cared so much for them. X-Men Apocalypse is by no means a great movie, but I did enjoy it more than something such as The Jungle Book, Deadpool, some movies that I've seen this year, as well as even The Avengers from last year. And despite maybe a handful of performances here and there, it is well acted. It's very competently directed by Bryan Singer. It's only when the CGI just comes running in is when things get a little muddy. As for my rating, I keep on going back and forth. Given everything I've said, I'm thinking of a lower score, but given how I actually feel, I'm thinking a higher score. On a more personal rating, I'm feeling a 3.5, but with a more critical rating, I gotta give X-Men Apocalypse an immensely strong 3 out of 5. So yes, I do recommend seeing this movie if you are a fan of the X-Men movies. If you're not, then it's not going to make a believer out of you. If you're somebody who has seen X-Men Apocalypse, then do let me know your thoughts on it. And as always, I'm Colin Kirkland, and thank you so much for watching.